This is going to be a reading from The Impressionist, a novel that is a good ways well along. This is only page 7. Festooned as it was with several baseball and winter caps, the coat rack in the living room standing just beyond the front door cast a shadow upon the far east interior wall of his house, with an image which resembled that of an eagle astride the tip of a long staff or spear. This vertical silhouette was well defined, suggestive. As a symbol, it spoke of power and authority, similar to the staff carried into Congress each workday morning when the representatives and senators there in Washington, D.C. need to show up for work. Theodopolis Bayfield gazed at this same silhouette as he stood in the middle of his living room, at first thinking that the stark image had a gargoyle-like quality. Then he reflected further. There was a resemblance between the shadow at which he was still gazing and the caduceus of physicians. Then a more general philosophical thought occurred to him that such symbols had evolved from more primitive forms over several millennia. Then, and this was at 5 o'clock in the morning, Theo began to think about his son, whose unreliable profession had now become apparently that of an impersonator and comedian. And during the last 4 years, while Jack had continued to pursue this new and unprofitable trade, he had called Theo nearly a dozen times, asking his father for a financial helping hand. "How much do you need this time, Jack?" Theo would say. "You're a grown man. You should face the consequences of every decision you make, regardless of whether you manage to get ahead or get taken to the cleaners." And then Jack would plead with him, "Come on, Dad, just a little to tide me over till the end of the month." Theo eventually would yield to his son's persistence. "How much cash are you sending Erica and those kids of yours each month?" $300. "Fuck, is that all? I'm surprised she hasn't ripped you a new one. She usually tries any time we happen to talk to one another on the phone. And how often is that?" "No more than once a month." "Jesus, Jack, you need to move on from this harebrained notion of yours that you can be a stand-up comic. You're living in a fucking dream world, bud." Ever since Theo's wife had passed away, Jack had begun to act as though he'd just fallen off a cliff. The death of his mother had shaken him, that much was clear. Theo knew that Jack had always entertained these vague hopes of getting into show business, but that Jack would allow himself to behave as though he had no responsibilities not only caused Theo no little concern, especially when Erica herself called him every so often to see if he would help her pay the rent. He felt ashamed of his son for neglecting his family, all for the sake of a lousy pipe dream. Over a lifetime of labor, Theo had made a respectable living as an electrician. He had always been able to hold his head up, and he supported his family and kept all of them well provided for. Theo could look anyone in the eye and felt equal to any man, and better than some. And now Jackson remained stubbornly in the position of being less than he could be. Not quite a disgrace, but getting there. By now, first light had set in, and Theo could begin to see the more distant outlines of his neighborhood, a skyline of trees and rooftops. The holiday season was just around the corner. He'd no doubt visit Erica and his grandkids, give his daughter-in-law, as he still thought of her, a bit of extra help. He had some money to spare, and he could afford it. Those kids were important to him. They and their mother were family, and if his son couldn't handle his responsibilities toward them, Theo would make sure they didn't go without. Recently, following the conclusion of a Saturday night gig at a large bar in Walla Walla, frequented by a crowd of under 30 types, many of them from Whitman College, Jack, now unwinding once again in his motel room at his Super 8, mulled over the notion of giving his ex-wife a call. He risked Erica berating him for his parsimonious monthly payments for child support. She was a high school English teacher and overly proud of her ability to toss up a well-turned phrase now and again, especially when she felt the energizing inspiration of resentment. But then, he reflected, he had fallen in love with her because of both her good looks and her wit. Over her high school and university years, she'd grown quite adept at sarcasm, in the way many women do, even working class women who wouldn't give a second thought to setting foot in a library. As a mother of their 2 children, she enjoyed the privileged position of absolute and irrefutable moral authority. And Jack knew from experience that she rarely, if ever, reevaluated her positions and changed her point of view. Jack's divorce attorney had managed to gain a decision from the judge which had granted him twice monthly visitation rights. He and Erica had been both raised in Spokane and had attended the same high school where they'd first gotten to know one another. During their college years, they went to different universities, Jack to WSU, while Erica remained in Spokane and enrolled at Gonzaga, a life move she'd dreamed about ever since she was 12. After graduation, Erica landed her first teaching job in Burns, Oregon, a town where they spent their week-long honeymoon looking for their first home to buy. With a rather substantial amount of assistance from both Theo and her parents, they were able to close a deal on a 2-bedroom home. And by mutual consent, they proposed to have either 2 or 3 children. While remaining in the isolated and very conservative town of Burns for 3 years, Erica taught English and drama at the single high school there, and Jack landed a job at an AM radio station, without question the small community's most liberal institution. Jack wrote all the advertisements, announced, did the news, along with his co-host Vicky Lamar, and of course he had his nightly show from 4 in the afternoon until midnight, when they closed down operations for another day and shut off the transmitter. A couple of part-timers came in to take up the slack on the weekends. Jack's at-work relationship with Vicky transformed over time into his first affair of any significance. They discovered they shared a bit in common, particularly their mutual fondness for arousing one another and then enjoying the customary passionate physical sensations which followed. Quite simply, Jack had allowed himself to be overcome by this energizing lust he so enjoyed with Vicky, who was regarded by many of their listening audience to be a local celebrity, in fact the only local celebrity in Burns. And even though they were co-workers, colleagues, neither one of them could afford to be seen together in public, except when they were doing a live afternoon promotional broadcast which ran from 4 p.m. until 6 o'clock, when Jack was on his own for the rest of the night and Vicky had gone home to cook dinner. During their 3rd year in Burns, Erica had become pregnant in late December, and she told Jack that she wanted to finish out her teaching contract with the Burns School District and then move back to Spokane, where, although she never quite admitted to this, she could be near her mother and her old friends, many of whom had also become mothers by that time. Jack sent out his resume to every radio broadcasting station in Spokane. By June, After 6 months of diligent job seeking within the confines of his profession, Jack had received merely 2 offers, even though he'd branched out to Coeur d'Alene and both Moses and Medical Lake. 2 offers. At least he had a choice. Then. Now, choices remained few and far between for Jack. Vicky had gotten married for the first time. And not quite a year ago. And much as he would have wanted to, he never phoned her any longer. What would be the point? Vicky had once given him a candle in a jar for his birthday. He carried it around with him on his travels. When he rolled in on the bus at the next town on his circuit, he'd then lug his single suitcase to the nearest budget rate motel and secure himself with a room for the night, after which he would unpack the suitcase, which contained only clothing apart from his occasional bottle of Madeira imported from Portugal and the candle Vicky had given him. After a performance, Jack would return to his motel room, pour himself a drink, and light Vicky's candle. With his glass of wine near at hand, Jack would soon set a match to the candle's wick. Then he would turn out all the lights in the room, sit back down, and watch the candle flame dance, flutter, and pulse within the protective, confining circular glass wall of its container. And whenever the level of molten wax descended within a half-inch of the base of the jar, Jack would simply insert a utility candle into its central space, renewing once again the jar's usefulness. This procedure, if you want to call it that, drew Jack into a very peaceful state of mind in short order. Sometimes he even woke up the following morning, the candle substantially consumed, discovering himself to be sitting in a chair rather than laying beneath the sheets and blankets of the bed. Next, from Bend, Oregon, his circuit with a rare deviation took him on to Pendleton, La Grande, and up into Walla Walla, then up Highway 101, where he concluded his 2-month round in Seattle. And in Seattle, Jack always worked as a warm-up act for someone with far more cachet than he enjoyed, his own name recognition nearly zilch. But each day he'd been working on the new routine he planned to launch at least once before reaching Seattle, where he held out some hope he would finally be spotted by some talent agent with a better eye than that of Wally Fringe, that half-blind, greedy prick. In Seattle, there was a well-known talent agent, an employee of the William Morris Agency, whose name was T-Bone Sledge Jefferson, former NFL football player who stood at 6 feet 3 inches and weighed in at a muscular 285 pounds. Only his good friends ever called him Sledge, a boyhood nickname his own father had given him after the man had set his son to work breaking up the tree-upturned, crumbling sidewalk in front of their house. Both his father and mother were taller than average. In fact, his mother was almost an inch taller than his father. She was the family matriarch and ran the show from morning to night. And you can bet that Sledge Jefferson deferred to his mother's opinion, and especially her wishes, just as did his father. And this was the gentleman whom Jack hoped to see, most of all, in the audience at the premier comedy club in Seattle, Roscoe's. They'd even spoken briefly once, Jack always calling him Mr. Jefferson rather than T-Bone, the way many others often did, deceiving themselves into thinking that T-Bone Jefferson would regard every single one of them as an old acquaintance never to be forgotten. After the few warm-up acts had concluded, a 15-minute pause would ensue until the main act got underway. Another scathing social satirist. Jack had hoped that during this brief interim he perhaps could seize the chance to talk with T-Bone Jefferson at the bar. And sure enough, not even 15 minutes after Jack had sat down, on one of the several empty stools, as most of the clientele had remained upstairs for the comedy show, Mr. Jefferson sauntered up to the bar and asked for a Royal Crown on the rocks, a double. He stepped purposely over to where Jack was seated and sat down with a single stool between them. "Hello, Bayfield. How you doing, my man? Say there, brother, I caught your act, of course, and I wanted to talk to you a bit about that." "Well, sure, Mr. Jefferson. I'm glad to. And hell, Jackson, don't call me Mr. Jefferson. Makes me sound like I'm on TV or some such shit. Anyway, I gotta say, I like your style, man." He rubbed his nose a moment and then continued. "You're not tossing off one-liners like Rodney Dangerfield, but, you know, you still keep the crowd laughing consistently. You maintain the energy in the crowd, man." "Well, thanks, T-Bone. I'm glad you think my act has some possibilities." "Oh, fuck, don't be so modest. You're good at what you do, man." Well, seeing that T-Bone Jefferson was beginning to open a door for him, one he had never passed through before, Jack felt a brief, wafting sense of elation and said, "I'd like to ask you something," suggesting that he would change the subject. "How did you get your first break into the NFL?" "You mean you don't know?" "Fuck, I thought everyone around here knew that," former football star said. "I should explain something about myself, T-Bone. The sports I'm interested in are gymnastics, amateur wrestling, boxing, and weightlifting. 3 out of 4 of these, well, I was into them once, back in my younger days. Mainly wrestling and weightlifting." "What's your best lift?" "Well, which lift are you talking about?" Jack said, a bit more precise now in his pronunciation. Let's say the military press." "Hell, it was years ago." "Well, just take a wild guess." Well, it was 170 pounds, I believe." "And how much did you weigh then?" "Oh, 155 mostly." "Well, fucking A, man, that's all right. I'm duly impressed. But I gotta ask you something. Why are you so ignorant about football?" "I never watch it, for one thing. Not even the Super Bowl." "I'll be dipped in shit and fried in oil." "It's true." All right, next chapter coming up. So Jack's a comedian with a few accents under his belt. Although he still wrestles with his French accent. He doesn't dare try to do a French accent on stage. He just can't do it yet. Anyway. All right, the birthday. Well, this is a completely different character. For a number of years while growing up, I lived in a small college town in western Washington state. From my bedroom window, I could see the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, whose great peaks range from Mount Shasta in California, on north through Mount Hood near Portland, then Mount St. Helens, which unleashed its volcanic fury in 1980, followed by Mount Rainier not far from Seattle, and finally, still within the United States, there is Mount Baker, another mostly inactive volcano, just about 20 miles outside of Bellingham. It was there in the town of Bellingham that my parents and my sister and I lived for a number of years. My parents were both university people, professors. My mother taught history and my father taught in the overlapping fields of medicine, organic chemistry, and the philosophy of science. And in this latter area, he collaborated with the Department of Philosophy. He worked with one philosophy professor in particular in developing a comprehensive reading list for the course which they taught jointly. And my personal belief is that the non-professional side of their relationship was not inevitable, I wouldn't say that. But I can also see that my father had little chance of not falling in love with this woman. My sister and I have talked about this many times over the years. Could Dad have ever avoided all that scandal, all that pain? Or, on the other hand, could Justine Lagrange have stood back and not have gotten involved with our father? Perhaps she could have remained indifferent to him. But that's not what happened. Although the home and immediate surroundings I grew up in as a child was rather idyllic, especially compared to what an unfortunate percentage of children in large cities experience, that same home I continued to grow up in as a teenager was one of turmoil and strife, and this all because of Justine Lagrange. This may surprise you, but I don't hate her. I met her several years ago and have gotten to know her. And I don't think I was ever unkind to her. Actually, we even still see each other on occasion, strangely perhaps. I've grown more and more interested in her over the years. Next week will be her 61st birthday. I plan to drive up to Bellingham to see her. She was 11 years younger than my father, and she once told me that she was 34 when she first met Dad. Not quite 6 months after that, they were having an affair. What I find most remarkable about Justine is that she never got married. I asked her about that once. She brushed her long hair aside, still a deep red in those days, and she said, "Your father was the love of my life, Bernard. No other man will ever mean as much to me as he did. I doubt very much I'll ever be motivated to marry anyone now. Not after your father. Not after Leo." All right. During the drive from Seattle to Bellingham, I stopped at a cafe in Mount Vernon for a break. Justine would be expecting me by mid-afternoon, the time that I'd mentioned on the phone to her the previous night that I'd probably arrive at her house. A nice 3-bedroom place just off one of the county highways a few miles north of Bellingham toward Ferndale. She had yet to retire and drove into Bellingham each day during the week to occupy her office, present her lectures, and mentor her students whenever any of them ventured up to the 4th floor of the building where the Department of Humanities was housed at one end of the hallway and the Department of Philosophy resided at the other end. She had the well-deserved and respected reputation of being considerate toward her students. Once she told me, no question from one of my students is too idiotic, provided it was posed with genuine curiosity. When I reached the gravel drive which led through her property past a few old gnarled apple trees to her house, her dog appeared, having darted out from the weed-strewn side of the road, and it began running alongside my car. When I pulled up in front of her house and got out of the car, the dog raced up to me in friendly greeting. For a moment I put up with the dog's ample affections and look of pleasure and excitement. He followed me up to the porch where I rang the doorbell and waited. A moment later, Justine opened the door, and while looking at me with a pleasant smile through the screen door, she said, Oh, Bernard, it's so good that you've come all this way to see me. Please come in, won't you? As I pulled open the screen door, her dog rushed past me, grazing my leg. She chided the dog as though it were an impolite child barging ahead of an adult, and led me into the living room and invited me to sit down. I made a pot of coffee a moment ago. I'll be right back, Bernie, so you make yourself comfortable. Do you take cream or sugar with your coffee? Only when I have heartburn, I said. She smiled again briefly and said, I'll be right back, so don't go away. Almost 4 years had passed since we'd last seen one another. She'd allowed her hair to ebb through a few shades of gray since then. She had it pinned up. She always wore her hair long. Waiting for her to return, I glanced around her living room. Absent was the familiar feature of a large, high-definition TV screen. Several plants were growing out of large pots. The walls were decorated with a few paintings, one an Impressionist-style scene of a park on a night when rain is still drizzling or has just ceased to fall. A pair of lovers huddled beneath an umbrella, lamplight reflecting from the wet sidewalk. She also had an antique-looking bookcase with glass-paneled doors, its shelves completely full. Lingering in the air was the hint of cannabis. She returned with a tray and set it down on the coffee table in front of the sofa where I was sitting. Upon the tray rested a pair of cups with saucers beneath them, as well as a French press, still a bit more than half full. As she sat down next to me, a discreet gap between us, and took one of the cups. In turn, I took the remaining cup and saucer and had a sip. It tasted quite good. So tell me, she said, almost gleeful, what sort of work are you doing nowadays? I've never worked at the same job for more than 5 years at a stretch. Presently, I was working for the city of Seattle on their arts commission as a recruiter for film production companies. Over the last 50 years, an appreciable number of movies have been made in Seattle, so it wasn't as though I was compelled to start from scratch, square one. At the Arts Commission offices, we have a fairly long list of companies I call on a routine basis about twice a month to see if they have any new irons in the fire. Justine became intrigued by this and asked me several questions about my approach. Up until the mass encroachment of the homeless, Seattle used to quite easily sell itself as a unique major American city, the colorful past, along with all its present-day attributes, as one of the principal West Coast shipping ports. Not wishing to linger over the everyday tedium of my job at the Arts Commission, I asked her about the courses she was teaching that quarter. Oh, I still have my duties with the 101 classes. Thank the gods that I've only got one of those this time around. I never enjoyed giving the same talk twice in one day. The course I enjoyed doing the most covers or tries to cover the intersection between philosophy and literature, as in Sartre, No Exit, or Musil's The Man Without Qualities, or even Bellow, who tended to lean into philosophy quite a bit in his later work. And of course, I hardly could have left out Don DeLillo. As for the other two courses I teach, they're pretty standard fare. Peirce, James, and Dewey in America, Russell and Wittgenstein in England, and Husserl and Heidegger in Germany. Bergson, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty somewhat later in France. Of all the names she rattled off, I recognized only 3 of them. You must have a lot of reading assignments.